Welcome back to RotoQL University. This is our NFL strategy course. We'll be splitting up these presentations by position, starting with quarterbacks. Today we're going to be talking about quarterback selection for cash games. I have Sahil here with me. And
How you doing, Mike?
really good, Sahil. Let's talk quarterbacks.
Yeah, so quarterbacks are going to be the backbone of your team generally, some of the more consistent players. So let's talk about cash games first, and what are the key metrics you really need to be looking at. Um, One of the most important is the average yards per attempt. This will give you an idea of how good the quarterback is, how good his teammates are, and in general, it's going to be one of the best stats to kind of give you a feel of what the quarterback's capable of doing and how many fantasy points he's going to generally put up. So you really want to look for a lot of yards per attempt. So anything that is kind of below seven yards per attempt are usually going to be situations you want to avoid, and anything kind of above that will allow you to get a lot of big plays. The next is play call distribution. So what do they throw? How often do they throw? In what situations do they throw? Um, Obviously, that will give us the number of attempts, and then you multiply that by your average yards per attempt, and that'll kind of give you a baseline yards projection. Um, and then the next, you need to look at the defense. How good a defense is it? Is it one of the defense that really try to limit the pass attempts, put a lot of pressure on it, and allow you to get a lot of rushing yards, or do they give up a lot of pass with the weak secondary? So obviously this is not too groundbreaking, but obviously you need to really pay attention to defense. Looking at the strength of schedule, that can give you a little context to a QB stats, especially in the beginning of the season. If he's performing poorly, is that because he's gone against some of the top defenses in the league? Or is his stats inflated from his competition? And salary. So in cash games, generally the rule is you don't want to pay up for high-priced QBs. Obviously, every slate is different, and there may be some cases, but you'll generally be able to get a good value or fantasy points for a decent salary from a QB in a good matchup that may not be at the upper echelon. So diving in, you really want to look at Vegas, especially to kind of narrow down your choices from some of the stuff that we looked at before. So projected points, which is a factor in each sport, that will kind of help you narrow down what are the teams that are expected to score the most points. More points equals more touchdowns, which is also a cornerstone of fantasy scoring. And then red zone attempts, and that's something you really want to look at is, does a team throw a lot in the red zone? Do they rush the ball from the 1 yard line? Do they frequently use play action passes to give a QB a 1 yard touchdown pass? So you want to look at what the tendencies are, and also look at the tendencies of the defense. Do they completely stack the box every time a team's within the 3 yard line, or are they a little more balanced? And going back, we want to look at game flow. And something that we'll look at a little bit more is that if a team is a huge favorite, they may not be passing much in the second half, which will definitely lower your fantasy expectation. Really what you want is a close game of two high-scoring offenses, so even in the fourth quarter, you may be able to get the benefit of a shootout where teams are scored 3 or 4 touchdowns in the last 10 minutes. So obviously that's not going to happen a lot, but if you can take advantage of that based on looking at the game flow, those situations can be quite lucrative. And another thing to look at is the high winds, precipitations, and weather. So the higher the wind, it's going to be tougher to get long passes and Obviously, short passes will be less affected, but you don't want to lose anything because of the wind. This definitely becomes more of a problem as you get closer into winter. With when the ball's cold and windy, you're going to see teams rely on the running game more. And same thing with precipitation. Precipitation's not that important, but if there's a very close situation, you might want to fade the QB that's playing in the rain because it is a little tougher to catch in the rain. Uh, so there's some things to keep in mind of, but more important, I think, is the wind rather than the precipitation for your QB scoring. So this is a kind of a visual that will kind of give you an idea of how many fantasy points are scored by whether a team's a favorite, an underdog, and more importantly, what the total line was. So obviously when there are not a lot of fantasy points scored or actual points scored, so a game that has a total around 40, you're going to get a lot fewer fantasy points there. So you'll get 26 combined fantasy points on average from both the QBs. And then you get a game that's a little higher, above 50, you're going to get about 50% more. So in this chart, we look at 51 plus points totals. You're going to get 38.6 combined fantasy points. And then the other thing to look at is that favorites are going to do slightly better. And that's simply because if teams can score more points, there's going to be more fantasy points going around. So a situation that you really want to look at is close favorites will kind of give you the most fantasy points on average. So yeah, so talking a little bit more about what we just talked about, focusing on QB, position with games with double-digit spreads. So if a team is bigger than a 10-point underdog, the QB may actually be not a good pick, despite the high team projected points, and that's because of the game flow. So if a team is up 14 points in the fourth quarter, they're not going to throw it very much. So losing those crunch time fourth quarter points is going to pretty much account for the bulk of this difference. And then as a dog, the difference is a little less stark. But still you want to avoid teams that aren't expected to score a lot of points, though that a QB will likely be throwing all the fourth quarter. But in this situation, it's likely a very tough matchup if they are underdogs by 10 or more points. So again, let's look at a little more of some splits that can kind of point you in the right direction. Something that shouldn't be a surprise is that home teams perform better, and we can see that in the home and road splits. So they're going to throw 0.15 more touchdowns a game, so that's going to account for 0.6 more fantasy points on both FanDuel and DraftKings, which can be the difference between a good and bad pick, because they're all fine margins. So you want to look for any situations that's going to be favorable. And then if we look at directly at fantasy value, we're going to see that home teams are both better picks on DraftKings and FanDuel. So a situation where you have two similar options, obviously you're going to want to favor the home quarterback. So let's talk about how lineup construction is going to work with QBs. So one thing we'll know is that higher priced QBs are going to be more consistent. Players like Drew Brees, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Ben Roethlisberger, they're going to always get their opportunities in the red zone and otherwise. So they'll be a little more consistent. But their higher price comes as a kind of a cautionary tale. Something that I really like to look for is lower price QBs that are in a very good matchup that will be able to get some touchdowns. Something about ownership is that we've talked about this a bit before in other videos, is we don't want to worry about ownership in cash games. We simply want to pick the team that we think is going to score the most points. Player usage is something that's interesting for QBs, since some QBs like a Drew Brees, Peyton Manning, although he's not going to be a DFS option anymore, they will score 0 points on the ground, where players like a Tyrod Taylor, Cam Newton, and Aaron Rodgers, for some part, are going to have some rushing yards. So having those rushing yards will allow you to be a little more consistent with your performance. They'll maybe be able to score a touchdown rushing, and their general overall higher usage will make them a better cash game and less variable in their performance. And as we just talked about before, we want to avoid QBs that are in big double-digit spreads, big games. QBs in close games are likely to get more opportunities to throw the ball and thus score more fantasy points. And days rest. Unless the matchup is really good, we want to avoid QBs playing in Thursday night games. Historically, the data has shown that they generally are worse performers, and coaches tend to be a little more conservative with their game plan because they don't have as much time to prepare. So looking back at some consistency stuff, we're going to look at the coefficient of variation for QBs. So this is the standard deviation of the data set divided by its mean. So what this means is that QBs are the least variable of all the positions. Because QBs have the ball in their hands at least every single play, they're not going to be as subject to as much variation of a running back or a wide receiver and tight end, who can be a lot more dependent on TDs, since a QB will be throwing the ball a lot, and he will likely get some fantasy points, and his number of touchdowns won't vary as much. Again, something we've talked about before is that when we look at QBs who are playing on 4 days rest, so that means they're coming from a Sunday to a Thursday night game, they have been pretty poor plays. This data is from 2014 NFL season, and this number has kind of come a little bit closer and not been as negative. It's still a situation that, unless the matchup is great, we really want to avoid. So let's take a look at a cash game from last year. I built it, cashed in a big double up. You can kind of look at the QB, which is Cam Newton. Obviously put up a monster performance, which is why we're showing you this lineup. But the important thing to look at here is that this is a close, high-scoring game, and a QB who gets a lot of rushing yards as well as passing yards and high usage. So Cam Newton makes a great play in a lot of situations, and especially against the New Orleans defense, who was very, very poor last year. You can see that Cam was a very good pick, and his ownership was quite high for QB2. But we're not worried as much about that, given that this is a cash game. So we have some more resources here if you want to learn some more, how you can learn more about DFS strategy, and more how you can learn about how to use RotoQL to help you construct winning lineups. So you can check out our videos at the Zendesk that tell you about how to use RotoQL. You can feel free to reach out to us with any questions you have. And you can definitely check out RotoQL University or RotoU, which has all our strategy videos for all sports and a lot coming for football.